Welcome to Naptime Knowledge. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension in your jaw soften. Feel the weight of your body settle comfortably into whatever is holding you. A mattress, a pillow, a couch, a chair. There is nothing you need to do right now. There is nowhere you need to be. The only thing asked of you tonight is to listen and to let the story carry you somewhere quiet and beautiful. Tonight, we are going on a very long journey. Not across land or sea, though we will cross both in our imagination. We are traveling across time itself. Back, far back. More than 5,000 years into the past, to a world that was ancient, even when ancient Greece was young. We are going to Egypt, to the land of the Pharaohs, to the world's first great civilization, a culture so rich and so enduring that its echoes can still be felt in almost every corner of the world we live in today. This story will unfold slowly and gently, the way the Nile unfolds as it moves toward the sea. Wide, calm, unhurried, full of quiet life. There are 14 chapters ahead of us, and each one will take us deeper into the world of ancient Egypt, its people, its gods, its rituals, its beliefs, its monuments, its mysteries. We will explore creation myths that are among the oldest stories ever told. We will meet gods whose names have been spoken for 5,000 years. We will stand in the shadow of monuments that have outlasted every empire and every civilization that came after them. You do not need to stay awake for all of it. In fact, the hope is that somewhere along the way, sleep will find you, gently, naturally. The way sleep always comes when the body is at rest and the mind is engaged by something calm and interesting and far away. If you drift off during Chapter 3 or Chapter 7 or Chapter 10, that is exactly right. That is exactly what is supposed to happen. So breathe, relax, and let us begin at the very beginning, with a river, and with the extraordinary civilization that grew along its banks. Chapter 1. The Gift of the Nile. How a river made a civilization. To understand ancient Egypt, you must first understand the Nile. This is not simply a geographical fact. It is a theological one, a philosophical one, a deeply personal one. The Nile was not merely the river that ran through Egypt. The Nile was Egypt. Without it, there would have been nothing. No pharaohs, no pyramids, no gods, no golden age lasting 3,000 years. Just desert and wind and silence. The Nile is the longest river in the world. From its most distant source, the Kagera River, deep in the mountains of Central Africa, far from any place the ancient Egyptians ever knew, to the point where its waters finally meet the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile stretches more than 4,000 miles. It flows north, which surprised early European explorers who expected rivers to flow south or east. It gathers tributaries and energy as it moves, cutting through the heart of the African continent until it reaches the Sahara, that vast and merciless desert that covers nearly a third of Africa's landmass. And there, in the middle of the Sahara, something extraordinary happens. The Nile does not dry up. It does not vanish into the sand, as smaller rivers do. It keeps flowing, carving a green ribbon of life through the pale, baked emptiness of the desert. On either side of the river, the land is fertile and lush, dark soil, dense vegetation, waving fields of grain. But step only a few 100 meters from the bank, and you are in the desert again. And the desert is absolute. There is a sharpness to the boundary between the green and the gold that is almost shocking. It is as if the world has been drawn with a ruler. Here, life. Here, death. Here, the gift. And here, the withdrawal of it. The Egyptians understood this boundary perfectly, and they thought about it constantly. They had words for both sides. Kemet, the black land, for the dark, fertile soil of the river's edge, and Deshret, the red land, for the desert beyond. They loved the black land with a fierce and grateful love. They feared and respected the red land as a place of death and danger, and they understood, with the clarity that comes from living your whole life on the edge of survival, that the difference between the two was the Nile. Every year, with a regularity that felt miraculous, the Nile flooded. The rains that fell in the distant mountains of Ethiopia swelled the blue Nile, one of the two great tributaries that joined to form the main river, and that surge of water moved northward, arriving in Egypt in the height of summer. The river rose slowly and majestically, spreading across its banks, covering the fields with a shallow inland sea. The Egyptians called this season Akhet, the inundation, and they waited for it with the eagerness of people who know that their survival depends on it. When the waters retreated, weeks later, they left behind a thin layer of dark silt, the most fertile soil imaginable, washed down from the volcanic highlands of Ethiopia, rich with minerals and organic matter. Plant a seed in this soil, and it would grow without much effort. The Egyptians called this annual gift the gift of the Nile, and they were right to call it a gift, because it was as reliable and as necessary as breathing. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, famously observed that Egypt was the gift of the Nile. He meant it as a geographical observation. Egypt would not exist without the river, but the Egyptians themselves would have understood the phrase in a deeper, more religious sense. The Nile was not merely their agricultural foundation, it was a divine presence in their lives, a god among gods, the source of all blessing and all life. The god of the Nile's inundation was called Happy, sometimes shown as a blue or green man, with a round, abundant belly and pendulous breasts, symbolizing both the river's masculine power and its feminine nurturing. Happy was not a creator god or a king of the gods. He was a god of simple, essential bounty. His feast was celebrated with joyful processions to the riverbank, with offerings of food and incense and flowers, with songs of gratitude that rose into the hot Egyptian air like the smoke of incense. The early settlements that appeared along the Nile's banks were not, at first, anything we would recognize as civilization. They were small villages of reed and mud houses, communities of a few dozen or a few hundred people living on fish and game, and the grain they grew in the flood-deposited soil. They buried their dead with care, placing them in shallow graves in the desert sand with simple offerings: a pot of food, a string of beads, sometimes the body of a beloved animal. Already, even in these earliest days, there was the suggestion of a belief in something beyond death. Already the seeds of what would become one of the world's great religious traditions were beginning to germinate. Over centuries and then millennia, these small communities grew larger. They began to trade with one another, grain for fish, pottery for flint tools, copper for linen. They developed more complex social structures, with village leaders and religious specialists who performed the rituals that kept the gods happy and the floods coming. They began to build larger structures, not just houses, but granaries, temples, administrative buildings. The communities grew into towns, and the towns began to assert themselves over their neighbors, and slowly, over thousands of years of competition and consolidation, something new appeared on the banks of the Nile. A state. By around 3500 BCE, two distinct kingdoms had emerged. Upper Egypt, the long, narrow stretch of the Nile Valley running south from a place the Greeks would later call Memphis, was ruled by a dynasty whose symbol was the white crown, a tall, bulbous form that looked a little like a bowling pin. Lower Egypt, the broad fan of the Nile Delta, where the river spread out into multiple channels before reaching the Mediterranean, was ruled by a different dynasty whose symbol was the red crown, a flat-topped form with a curl at the back. The two kingdoms had distinct cultures, distinct artistic traditions, and distinct royal courts. They were, in many ways, quite different places. And then, around 3100 BCE, they became one. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt is traditionally attributed to a king named Narmer, known to some ancient sources as Menes, who conquered the north and brought the two kingdoms under a single rule. The Narmer palette, a carved slate object found in the ancient city of Hierakonpolis, shows a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down an enemy on one side, and wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, as if to say, I am both. I am all. Egypt is one. This unification was far more than a political event. In Egyptian thought, it was a cosmic one, a moment when the forces of order and harmony prevailed over the forces of disorder and fragmentation. The pharaoh who wore both crowns was not just a king. He was the living embodiment of cosmic order, the axis around which the whole of creation turned. His duty was to maintain Ma'at, that beautiful and demanding Egyptian concept of rightness, truth, and cosmic balance in all things, at all times. The world depended on him. The gods were watching. Breathe in the warm, green smell of the river. Feel the cool water on your feet as you stand at the bank. The sun is strong and golden, and somewhere in the distance, a heron is standing very still at the water's edge, watching the river with ancient, patient eyes. Chapter 2. The Pharaoh, a living god among men. At the center of everything in ancient Egypt stood the pharaoh, not a president or a prime minister or a king in the modern sense, not simply the most powerful person in the land, but something far more extraordinary, a living god, the bridge between heaven and earth, the son of Ra, the child of the divine, the one whose presence guaranteed the continuity of the cosmos. The theology of pharaonic power was complex and carefully developed, but its core was simple. The pharaoh was not fully human. He partook of the divine nature. During his lifetime, he was understood to be the earthly manifestation of Horus, the falcon god of the sky and of kingship. When he died, he became Osiris, the god of the dead and the king of the underworld. And when his son took the throne, that son became Horus once more. and Osiris, who was his father, sent his divine power up from the underworld to sustain the living king. That was not metaphor. It was not mere political propaganda, or at least it was not only that. The Egyptians genuinely believed it. The pharaoh's divine nature was as real to them as the divine nature of the sun. It was attested by the rituals performed at his coronation, confirmed by the priests who served in the temples he maintained, expressed in the art and architecture that surrounded his every public appearance. To look upon the pharaoh in his full regalia, his double crown, his crook and flail, his false beard, his kilt of white linen, was to look upon the divine itself. The word pharaoh comes from the ancient Egyptian Pharaoh, meaning great house. Originally it referred to the royal palace, the institution of kingship, rather than the person of the king. Over time, as so often happens with words, the institution and the person became conflated, and Pharaoh became the standard way to refer to the king himself. By the time of the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, it was the common form of address for the ruler, and it is through the ancient Greek form pharaoh that the word has come down to us. The pharaoh's responsibilities were immense. He was the supreme military commander, the chief priest of every god in Egypt, the ultimate owner of all land and all resources, the final judge in legal disputes, the director of all building projects, the diplomat who negotiated treaties with foreign powers, and the spiritual guardian whose personal righteousness ensured the goodwill of the gods. He was also, at least in theory, the one who performed the daily ritual care of the gods, washing and dressing and feeding the divine statues in every temple in Egypt. In practice, of course, he could not be in 10,000 places at once, and these duties were delegated to the priestly orders. But in the formal theology, it was always the pharaoh performing the rites. The temple walls showed him, not the priests, standing before the gods. The life of the pharaoh was governed by ritual from before dawn until after dusk. He rose early, was bathed and anointed with sacred oils, dressed by attendants who were themselves of high priestly rank. His meals were elaborate ceremonies. His appearances in public were carefully choreographed performances, designed to express and reinforce his divine nature. Even his sleep was hedged about with ritual significance. The pharaoh was thought to receive divine communications in dreams, and certain dreams were interpreted by special dream priests who attended him. And yet, underneath all of this ritual and theology, the pharaohs were also deeply, recognizably human. We know this from the evidence they left behind, not only their monuments and their official inscriptions, which are naturally celebratory and idealized, but from the more intimate records that survive from ancient Egypt, administrative papyri, letters, medical documents, workers' records. From these we can glimpse the pharaohs as they actually were, some brilliant and driven, some cautious and methodical, some impetuous and prone to personal crises, some generous to their servants, and some terrifying in their rages. Rameses II, the great Rameses, who ruled Egypt for 66 years in the 13th century BCE, and who is often tentatively identified with the pharaoh of the Exodus story, was a man of extraordinary energy and self-promotion. He fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, a massive military engagement that ended roughly in a draw, and then spent the next 40 years commissioning monuments, inscriptions, and statues proclaiming it as his personal victory. He had more than 100 children. He lived to the age of roughly 90, which was almost unheard of in the ancient world. His mummy, which was found in 1881 in a cache of royal mummies hidden by priests from tomb robbers, shows a man of impressive physical stature, with a strong jaw, a large nose, and red hair that had been carefully dyed in old age to maintain the appearance of youthful vitality. Thutmose III, who ruled in the 15th century BCE, was by any measure one of the greatest military commanders in the ancient world. He led 17 successful military campaigns into Canaan and Syria, expanding Egyptian power to its greatest historical extent. He was also, by all accounts, a scholar and a naturalist. On the walls of the temple at Karnak, he had carved hundreds of images of the exotic plants and animals he had encountered on his campaigns, creating what might be considered the world's first natural history museum. He was a complex man, capable of extraordinary ambition and great curiosity in equal measure. Tutankhamun, the boy king who died at roughly 19 years of age, and whose tomb was discovered largely intact by the archaeologist Howard Carter in 1922, has become the most famous of all the pharaohs, not because of what he accomplished during his brief reign, but because of what Carter found when he opened his tomb. 4 nested rooms packed from floor to ceiling with objects of breathtaking beauty and historical significance. Gold everywhere. The golden death mask with its serene, boyish face, chariots and bows and arrows, musical instruments, alabaster vessels, linen garments, games for playing in eternity. The accumulated wealth and beauty of the ancient world, sealed away for 3,300 years, and then opened into the light of a November morning in 1922, while the whole world held its breath. Every pharaoh was unique. Every pharaoh had his or her own personality, ambitions, fears, relationships, and legacy. But all of them shared the burden and the extraordinary privilege of being the point of contact between the human and the divine, the one who stood at the center of the world and held it by their presence and their actions in its proper order. Let your breath deepen now. Let the image of the pharaoh, serene, golden, impossibly distant, and yet somehow familiar, settle at the edges of your consciousness as sleep draws gently closer. Chapter 3. Hatshepsut, the woman who was Pharaoh. Among all the extraordinary people who wore the double crown of Egypt, one stands in a category of her own, not because she was the only woman to rule Egypt, but because of the sheer scale of her achievement, the mystery that surrounded her for so many centuries, and the quiet magnificence of what she built and what she left behind. Her name was Hatshepsut, and she ruled Egypt for roughly 20 years in the 15th century BCE. Hatshepsut was not born to rule. She was born the daughter of Thutmose I, a great warrior pharaoh who expanded Egypt's borders and filled its coffers with tribute from conquered lands. When her father died, power passed to her half-brother, Thutmose II, who was also her husband. The practice of royal siblings marrying each other was common in ancient Egypt, a way of keeping the divine bloodline pure and the succession secure. Hatshepsut became Great Royal Wife, the highest female title in Egypt. Thutmose II was not a strong or particularly long-lived ruler. When he died, his heir, a young boy named Thutmose III, born to a secondary wife rather than to Hatshepsut, was too young to rule effectively. Hatshepsut became regent, governing in her stepson's name. And then, gradually, something changed. Hatshepsut began to assume the full royal titulary. She had herself depicted in official artwork in the traditional garb of the male pharaoh. She wore the white and red crowns. She wore the false beard, that symbol of divine kingship. She called herself Pharaoh. The boldness of this move is difficult to overstate. Egyptian kingship was, at its theological core, male. The myths of divine succession moved from father to son, from Osiris to Horus. The iconography of the king was the iconography of a man, and Hatshepsut, knowing all of this, stepped into it anyway, carefully, methodically, with the backing of the powerful priests of Amun at Karnak, who had every political reason to support a ruler under whose patronage their temples would grow rich. She ruled brilliantly. The evidence suggests a reign of remarkable stability and prosperity. She sent a major trading expedition to the land of Punt, a distant and somewhat mysterious place, probably in the region of modern Somalia or Eritrea, that returned laden with myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, gold, exotic animals, and living incense trees, which were planted in the terraced gardens of her great mortuary temple. She commissioned extensive building projects at Karnak, adding a suite of chapels and a pair of the tallest obelisks ever erected in Egypt, their tips sheathed in gleaming electrum. She built her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, and it is one of the most beautiful structures that has survived from the ancient world. Deir el-Bahri is carved into and against the golden limestone cliffs on the western side of the Nile, looking out across the river toward Karnak and the rising sun. It rises in 3 broad colonnaded terraces, each one set back against the cliff, the whole structure framed by the rocky escarpment behind it in a way that makes it look as if it grew from the living rock. Its walls were once painted in brilliant colors. The whole story of Hatshepsut's divine birth, her trading expedition to Punt, her great achievements, though the paint has mostly faded now, leaving the pale limestone bare and serene. Even in its weathered state, it is extraordinary. It breathes a quiet confidence, the confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted to leave behind. After Hatshepsut died, her stepson Thutmose III, who had by now grown into a capable and ambitious ruler in his own right, had her image removed from many of her monuments. Not immediately, and not all at once. The erasure began years after her death, when Thutmose III was himself an old man. Scholars debate the reasons. Was it revenge for years of being sidelined? Was it a theological concern about the precedent she had set? Was it simply a desire to restore the traditional narrative of male royal succession? We do not know for certain. What we do know is that the erasure worked, for a while. For more than 3,000 years, Hatshepsut was missing from the historical record. Egyptologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries, piecing together the sequence of pharaohs from inscriptions and king lists, were confused by the evidence at Deir el-Bahri and other sites, where a clearly royal female figure appeared, where a male one should have been. It was not until 1903 that the Egyptologist Edouard Naville began to reconstruct Hatshepsut's story, and not until the later 20th century that the full picture came into focus. Today, Hatshepsut's mummy rests in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, identified in 2007 through a combination of DNA analysis and a tooth found in a canopic box bearing her name. She is shown to have been a heavy-set woman in her 50s at the time of her death, suffering from diabetes and bone cancer, mortal, after all, as we all are. But the temple at Deir el-Bahri still stands, and the obelisks at Karnak still point toward the sky, and her name is spoken again, thousands of years after the man who tried to erase it returned to the dust. Breathe softly now. Feel the gentle weight of time passing, like sand through an open hand. Chapter 4. The Gods of Egypt, a universe alive with the divine. Of all the gifts that ancient Egypt left to the world, perhaps none is more vivid, more varied, or more endlessly fascinating than its mythology, the vast and complex world of its gods. Egypt was not a land of one god or 2 gods or 12 gods. Egypt was a land of hundreds of gods, perhaps thousands, each with their own personality, their own stories, their own areas of divine competence, their own temples and priesthoods and feast days and sacred animals. The modern mind sometimes struggles with this multiplicity. We are accustomed to thinking of religion as a single, unified system of belief, one set of scriptures, one creed, one God. Egyptian religion was something quite different. It was not a system designed for intellectual consistency. It was a living, evolving, deeply personal relationship between a people and the sacred forces they perceived in the world around them. The gods were not abstract philosophical propositions. They were presences, immediate, accessible, capable of being pleased and displeased, capable of helping and harming, capable of being asked in prayer and ritual for specific things. The gods of Egypt took many forms. Some appeared as fully human figures, clothed in the white linen of divine priests or the gold and jewels of royalty, carrying specific symbols that identified their natures and powers. Others appeared as animals, the falcon of Horus, the jackal of Anubis, the ibis of Thoth, the cat of Bastet, the cobra of Wadjet, the cow of Hathor, the crocodile of Sobek, the hippopotamus of Taweret. Many appeared as what modern observers sometimes call therianthropic forms, hybrid figures combining animal and human, a human body with an animal head, or an animal body with a human face. These hybrid forms were not random or arbitrary. Every animal the Egyptians chose to represent a deity carried specific symbolic resonances, qualities that the Egyptians perceived as expressions of divine nature. The falcon, with its extraordinary vision and its ability to soar to heights invisible to human eyes, was a natural emblem of the sky god Horus. The jackal, which haunted the edges of the desert where the cemeteries were, was a natural emblem of Anubis, the guide of the dead. The ibis, which stood with thoughtful patience at the water's edge and seemed always to be contemplating something, was a natural emblem of Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. The crocodile, powerful and sudden and lurking in the waters that were the source of all life, was a natural emblem of Sobek, god of the Nile's dark and fertile power. At the head of the divine hierarchy, though Egyptian religion had no single fixed hierarchy, and different regions and different periods elevated different gods to prominence, stood Ra, the sun god. Ra was typically depicted as a man with the head of a falcon, wearing a great sun disk on his head, encircled by a rearing cobra, the uraeus, whose venom protected the divine from harm. He was the creator of the world, the source of light and warmth, the one whose daily journey across the sky sustained all life. Ra's journey was the central drama of every Egyptian day. In the morning, he was born, a child, small and golden, rising from the waters of the eastern horizon. As the day progressed, he aged. The noon sun was Ra in his full maturity, powerful and blazing and high in the sky. By afternoon he was growing old, and by evening he was an old man, a ram, the setting sun's deep red, a reflection of his ancient, weary dignity. And then, in the darkness, he descended into the underworld, the Duat, to make his perilous nightly journey through 12 hours of darkness and danger. The nightly journey of Ra was terrifying. The underworld was full of demons and obstacles, of twisting tunnels and locked doors, of hostile spirits who sought to prevent the sun's passage. The greatest of these threats was Apep, also called Apophis, the great serpent of chaos, an enormous snake whose coils filled the deepest darkness of the underworld, and whose one purpose was to swallow Ra, to devour the sun and plunge the world into permanent darkness. Every night, Ra and his crew of divine helpers battled Apep. They drove him back with spells and weapons. The goddess Serket bound him with her scorpion venom. The god Set, for even the god of chaos had his role in cosmic order, drove his spear into the serpent's body. And every morning, Ra emerged victorious from the eastern horizon, young and golden and burning, and the world was saved again. This nightly battle was not merely a myth. It was a theological truth that required human participation. Priests in temples across Egypt performed anti-Apep rituals every night, reciting spells, burning effigies of the serpent, spitting on his image. They believed, genuinely believed, that without this ritual support, the battle might go differently. The sun might not rise, chaos might win. The world as they knew it might end. The priests of Egypt, rising before dawn to perform their sacred rites, were quite literally helping to keep the universe running. Alongside Ra stood hundreds of other gods, each with their own domain and their own devotees. Hathor, the goddess of love and music and beauty, was depicted as a cow or a woman with cow's ears, and her worship was joyful and sensuous. Her temples rang with music and dancing. Her feast days were celebrations of all the pleasures the gods had given to human life. Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war and healing, was fierce and dangerous, her breath said to be a hot desert wind, her power over disease and medicine making her paradoxically both the source of illness and its cure. Ptah, the craftsman god of Memphis, was depicted as a mummy figure, completely wrapped in his shroud, his hands emerging to hold a combined scepter of divine power. The god of creation as an artificer, a maker, one who brought things into being through the skilled use of hands and mind. Thoth, the ibis-headed god, deserves particular attention because his domain was one of the most important in Egyptian life: writing, knowledge, measurement, the moon, magic, and the record of time itself. He was said to have invented writing, one of the most consequential inventions in human history, and to have recorded the deeds of every human being in his great divine ledger. He was the divine scribe, the keeper of cosmic accounts. In the Hall of Two Truths, where the dead were judged, it was Thoth who recorded the result of the weighing of the heart, his ibis, head bent attentively over his scroll, his stylus moving with the precision of divine impartiality. The Egyptians approached their gods with pragmatic affection. The relationship was not one of submission before an all-powerful and unknowable deity. It was more like a relationship between clients and powerful patrons. The people needed things, and the gods could provide them in exchange for worship, offerings, and the maintenance of the temples that were the gods' homes on earth. You prayed to Sobek for protection on the river. You prayed to Hathor for success in love. You prayed to Thoth for success in an examination. You prayed to Sekhmet to be spared from plague. The gods were useful. The gods were present. The gods were, in a very real sense, neighbors. Feel your breath slow and deepen. Let the image of those gods drift through your mind like figures in a dream. The falcon, the jackal, the ibis, the cat, each one carrying in their animal form some quality of the divine that the Egyptians had recognized and named and loved. Chapter 5. Osiris, Isis, and the great myth of death and resurrection. Among all the myths of ancient Egypt, one stands above the others in its influence, its beauty, and its enduring power. It is the story of Osiris and Isis, a story of love and death and resurrection, of grief and determination, and the triumph of life over the darkness that waits at the end of every life. It is a story that the Egyptians told and retold for 3,000 years, that their priests recited in their temples, and their scribes recorded on their papyrus scrolls, that their poets embellished and their theologians interpreted. And it is a story whose echoes can be heard, if you listen carefully, in the stories of many religions that came after it. Osiris was the first king, not merely the first pharaoh of history, though the Egyptians understood him that way too, but the first ruler of all creation, a god who had walked the earth in human form and taught humanity everything that made civilization possible. He taught people how to grow grain. He taught them the art of wine-making. He gave them laws and music and the worship of the gods. He was gentle and wise and deeply loved by all who knew him, by his people, by the other gods, and most of all by his wife Isis, who loved him with a love that would, in time, prove stronger than death itself. But Osiris had a brother, Set, the god of storms, the lord of the desert, the embodiment of the wild and uncontrollable forces of nature that threaten all ordered things. Set was not simply evil. Egyptian thought was generally too nuanced for simple villainy. Set had his role in the cosmic order. He was the storm that the crops sometimes needed. He was the desert wind that cooled the overbearing heat. He was the chaos that kept order from becoming stagnation. But Set was also jealous. He wanted what his brother had, the throne, the love of the people, the warmth of a wife like Isis. According to the most vivid version of the myth, Set devised a terrible plan. He had a magnificent chest made, a beautiful box of cedar and ebony and gold, exactly the size and shape of Osiris's body. At a great feast, he brought this chest in and announced a game. Whoever could fit perfectly inside it would receive it as a gift. One by one, the guests tried and failed, and then Osiris, unsuspecting, climbed in, and the lid slammed shut, sealed with molten lead, and Set and his conspirators threw the chest into the Nile. The chest floated out to sea and came to rest on the shores of a distant land called Byblos, in what is now Lebanon, where it became entangled in the roots of a great cedar tree. The tree grew around it, enclosing it, until the king of Byblos cut the tree down to use as a pillar in his palace, not knowing that the god of Egypt lay inside it. And Isis searched. The moment Osiris was gone, she began her search, traveling the world asking every creature she met, the winds, the animals, the spirits of the earth, if they had seen her husband. She traveled to Byblos and worked her way into the royal household, eventually revealing herself to the queen and recovering the pillar, and with it the body of Osiris. She brought him home to Egypt. But Set was not finished. He found the body, and in his fury he cut it into 14 pieces, or in some versions 42 pieces, one for each of the nomes of Egypt, and scattered them across the length and breadth of the land. And Isis searched again. She traveled every corner of Egypt, gathering the pieces of her husband, one by one, putting him back together with her love and her magic. She found all but one piece, his heart, in some versions, his phallus in others, which had been swallowed by a Nile fish. When she had gathered all that she could find, Isis used her magic to animate the broken body of Osiris. She breathed life into him. She wrapped her wings, for she was sometimes depicted as a great bird, a kite, hovering over the body of her husband, around him in an embrace that transcended the boundary between life and death. And in that moment of restored life, she conceived their son, Horus. Then Osiris died again, or rather, he became something new. He descended to the underworld and took his throne there, becoming the king of the dead, the lord of eternity, the judge of the souls of all who had ever lived. His resurrection was not a return to the world of the living, but a passage into a different kind of life. One that was, perhaps, even greater than what he had left behind. And Isis gave birth to Horus, and hid him in the marshes of the delta, far from the reach of Set, and raised him in secret until he was strong enough to take his father's throne. This story was the central myth of Egyptian religion, and its meaning reverberated through every aspect of Egyptian life. The death of Osiris was the death of all things. The resurrection of Osiris was the resurrection of all things. The hope that Isis's love and magic gave to her dead husband was the same hope that every Egyptian man and woman carried in their hearts as they went about their daily lives. That death was not the end, that the love of those who mourned you had real power, that the soul could be gathered up from its scattered state and made whole again, that somewhere on the other side of death, a throne was waiting. The annual flooding of the Nile, that annual gift of dark, life-giving soil, was understood as a manifestation of the resurrection of Osiris. The dark silt that the river left behind was the body of the god. Enriching the earth, the grain that grew in that silt was the god made flesh, offering himself to nourish the living. Every harvest was a kind of communion. Every loaf of bread was a gift from a god who had died and been reborn. Let yourself drift now, gently, like a boat on a slow river. The story of Osiris and Isis has been told 1,000,000 times, across 5,000 years, and it is still being told tonight, here in the quiet dark, as you lie still and let sleep find you. Chapter 6. The Creation of the World. In the beginning, the waters. Every great culture asks the great question, where did everything come from? How did the world begin? The Egyptians asked this question too, and they answered it not with one story, but with several. Different theological traditions developed in different cities over different periods, each one capturing a different aspect of a truth too large to be contained in a single narrative. The most widespread and ancient of these creation stories begins in the same place where all Egyptian thought ultimately begins, the Nile. Or rather, it begins with the idea of the Nile extended to its absolute limit, with the image of an infinite, boundless, formless body of water, containing all potential and no actuality, all possibility and no existence. The Egyptians called this primordial ocean Nun. Nun was not quite a god, though he was sometimes addressed as one. He was more like the condition before existence, the state of the universe before anything had happened to it. Dark, quiet, deep, without surface or bottom, without direction or dimension. Everything that would ever exist was in Nun, but only as potential, the way a seed contains the potential of a tree without yet being one. And then, from those infinite waters, something rose. A mound of earth appeared, dry, solid, specific. The Egyptians called this the primordial hill, or the Benben, and they regarded it as the most sacred spot in all creation, the first point of order in a universe of formlessness, the first place where being emerged from non-being. In the great temple at Heliopolis, the city of the sun in Lower Egypt, a stone called the Benben stone was kept in the innermost sanctuary, a stone said to be the very original of that first hill, the physical relic of creation's first moment. Standing on the primordial hill was a god. In the Heliopolitan tradition, the creation theology developed by the priests of Heliopolis, this god was Atum, whose name means both the complete one and the one who has not yet come into being, a divine paradox expressing the idea of a self-creating, self-sufficient origin. Atum was alone. There was nothing and no one else, and from his solitude he generated the first pair of gods, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. From Shu and Tefnut came Geb and Nut, the earth god and the sky goddess, a pair so deeply in love that they could not be separated, their bodies always intertwined. Shu, the god of air, had to physically hold them apart, stand in between them with his arms raised, pressing Nut's arching body upward and keeping Geb's earth body down below. The space between them was the air we breathe, the room in which all living things exist. Geb and Nut had 4 children, Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, and from this divine family, the Ennead, the 9 gods of Heliopolis, all other creation flowed. The gods multiplied and differentiated. The world took shape. The Nile began to flow between its banks. The sun rose for the first time. Life appeared on the fertile earth. In Memphis, the creation story was different. The priests of Ptah, the craftsman god, taught that the world was created not through physical generation, but through thought and speech. Ptah conceived the world in his heart. The Egyptians located the mind in the heart, not the brain, and then spoke it into existence. He thought of each thing, and then he named it, and the naming was the making. Every god, every creature, Every plant, every stone came into being because Ptah had thought it and named it. This Memphite theology is one of the most philosophically sophisticated creation narratives in the ancient world. The idea that reality is constituted by language, that to name something is, in a deep sense, to create it, is an idea that has echoed through many subsequent philosophical and theological traditions. The Gospel of John, written more than 2,000 years after the Memphite priests first articulated this idea, begins with the words, "In the beginning was the Word." The relationship between these traditions is not simple or direct, but the resonance is unmistakable. In the city of Hermopolis, there was yet another creation story. The local theology described a world that existed before creation in a state of primordial chaos characterized by 4 pairs of deities, representing darkness, formlessness, the hidden and the boundless waters, collectively known as the Ogdoad, the group of 8. These 8 gods of chaos swam in the primordial waters like great frogs and serpents, until their combined energy generated a divine egg, from which the sun god hatched, flooding the world with light and beginning the process of creation. What is remarkable about all of these stories is how they complement rather than contradict one another. The Egyptians did not feel compelled to choose between them. Multiple creation myths could be simultaneously true, each capturing a different facet of a reality, too vast and complex for any single story to encompass. This intellectual flexibility, this willingness to hold multiple truths in productive tension rather than forcing them into a single, exclusive system, is one of the most distinctive and admirable features of Egyptian religious thought. The priests of different temples engaged in what might be called competitive theology, each arguing for the primacy of their particular god and their particular creation's narrative. But on the whole, Egyptian religious culture was characterized less by conflict than by synthesis. The tendency to identify different gods with one another, to combine their mythologies, to see in one divine figure the presence of another. Ra-Amun, Ptah Sokar Osiris, Amun-Ra-Atum, compound divine names testify to a religious culture that was constantly synthesizing, constantly expanding, constantly finding new ways to express the inexhaustible richness of the sacred. Let the thought of those ancient waters fill your mind, deep, dark, infinite, full of sleeping potential. Feel your body growing heavier, sinking gently toward the cool, quiet depths of sleep. Chapter 7. Ma'at, the feather that balanced the world. Among all the concepts in Egyptian religion and philosophy, perhaps none is more central, more pervasive, or more beautiful than Ma'at. She was a goddess, depicted as a woman with a single ostrich feather in her hair, sometimes shown with wings, but she was also something more fundamental than any individual deity. She was the principle of rightness itself, the cosmic order upon which everything else depended. Ma'at was truth. Ma'at was justice. Ma'at was harmony, balance, the proper relationship between all things. She was the order that kept the stars in their courses, the Nile in its banks, the seasons following one another in their proper sequence, the scales of justice balanced. She was the principle that made the sun rise every morning and set every evening in precisely the way it should. She was the reason why the world made sense. The concept of Ma'at governed not only cosmic events, but human behavior. To act with Ma'at was to act rightly, to speak truth, to deal fairly, to give back what was borrowed, to care for those who were weaker, to refrain from theft and violence and deception. The negative confessions, that remarkable list of moral declarations that the deceased made before the divine judges in the Hall of Two Truths, were essentially a declaration of having lived in Ma'at. I have spoken truth. I have not stolen. I have not caused pain. I have given bread to the hungry and water to the thirsty. The opposite of Ma'at was Isfet, chaos, disorder, injustice, the state of things when the proper relationships between them break down. Isfet was what happened when a pharaoh was unworthy, when priests neglected their rituals, when people acted unjustly toward one another, when the divine order was violated and the cosmos began, however slightly, to tip out of balance. The pharaoh's most essential duty was to uphold Ma'at in all things. In temple reliefs, he is often shown making an offering to the gods, and the offering he makes is a small figure of Ma'at herself, a tiny statuette of the goddess held in his outstretched hands. The message is clear. The pharaoh's gift to the gods is rightness itself. His reign is defined by his ability to maintain the order that the gods require and that the world needs to function. The ostrich feather that was Ma'at's symbol, the feather that sat in her headdress and was placed on the scales against the heart of the deceased, was chosen for reasons that are not entirely clear to modern scholars. But the ostrich feather is remarkably symmetrical, each side an almost perfect mirror of the other, and perhaps it was this perfect balance that recommended it as a symbol of the balanced, righteous life. Ma'at was not only an Egyptian concept, but it was in Egypt that it was most systematically developed and most deeply integrated into every aspect of social and religious life. The idea that the universe is fundamentally ordered, that there is a right way to live and a wrong way, that human actions have cosmic significance, that how we treat each other matters not just to us, but to the fabric of reality itself, is an idea that Ma'at expressed with extraordinary clarity and beauty more than 5,000 years ago. And the Egyptians knew that Ma'at was not a given. It had to be worked for. It had to be maintained actively, by conscious effort, by the pharaoh in his governance, by the priests in their rituals, by every ordinary person in the choices they made every day. The world was not permanently ordered. It was held in order by the accumulated weight of all the right actions, of all the living and all the dead. Ma'at was, in this sense, a shared project, a civilization-wide effort to sustain something precious and fragile against the always present threat of chaos. As you lie here in the quiet, let the image of those perfect scales settle into your mind. Heart on one side, feather on the other, the great stillness of a moment perfectly balanced. That is Ma'at. That is what the Egyptians were reaching for in all their temples and all their rituals and all their art, across all those thousands of years. Chapter 8. The Weighing of the Heart. Judgment in the Hall of Two Truths. We have spoken of the afterlife already, but let us dwell there a little longer, because the Egyptian conception of what happens after death is one of the most elaborate, most morally serious, and most moving in all of human religious thought. It deserves to be explored slowly, carefully, in full. When an Egyptian died, the soul, which the Egyptians conceived of as several distinct but related components, began a journey. There was the car, something like the life force, which remained close to the body, and which was sustained by the offerings left in the tomb. There was the Bey, something more like the individual personality or soul, which was depicted as a human-headed bird, and which could travel freely between the world of the living and the world of the dead. There was the Ayak, the glorified and perfected spirit of the dead person, which had successfully navigated the afterlife and joined the company of the imperishable ones in the sky. The journey to the field of reeds began immediately after death. The soul of the deceased found itself in a long, dark corridor, the entrance to the Duat, the underworld, and had to make its way through a series of gates and guardians, each one requiring the correct passwords or spells to pass. These spells were provided by the priests and scribes who prepared the burial, written on papyrus scrolls and placed in the coffin, inscribed on the tomb walls, incorporated into the wrappings of the mummy itself. They were, in essence, a complete guidebook for the journey through the underworld, and they are what we now call the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead, its Egyptian name was more accurately translated as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, was not a single, fixed text, but a collection of spells and instructions that was assembled differently for each individual, based on what their family could afford and what they wanted to emphasize. Wealthy Egyptians had elaborate, beautifully illustrated papyri, with images of each stage of the afterlife journey rendered in delicate colors. Poorer people might have only a few key spells written on a small scrap of papyrus tucked under their head. But the goal was the same for everyone: to pass safely through the underworld and reach the presence of Osiris. At the end of the journey, the deceased arrived at the Hall of Two Truths, a great columned hall, presided over by Osiris himself, surrounded by 42 divine judges, each one representing a different sin that the deceased must declare their innocence of. Thoth stood ready with his stylus and scroll. Anubis waited by the great scales. The heart of the deceased was placed in one pan of the scale. In the other pan was placed the feather of Maat. The scales were perfectly balanced instruments, sensitive to the weight of a single lifetime's choices. The heart, which the Egyptians believed retained within it all the memories and deeds of a person's life, was weighed against the feather of cosmic rightness. If the heart balanced the feather, if the person had lived in truth and justice and compassion, the scales held steady, and the verdict was favorable. The soul was declared Ma'akeru, true of voice, justified, and was welcomed into the field of reeds. There they would live forever in a landscape that was Egypt perfected, the Nile flowing always, the grain growing always, the air soft and warm, every joy available, and every sorrow absent. If the heart was heavy, if it carried the weight of cruelty and deception and injustice, it sank in the scale, and Ammit, the great devourer, was waiting. Ammit was one of the most unusual figures in Egyptian religion. A hybrid creature with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, all three of the most dangerous animals the Egyptians knew, combined into one terrifying form. Ammit ate the heavy heart, and the soul of the sinner ceased to exist. Not hell, not eternal punishment, simply the absolute and final end of the self. The negative confessions that the deceased made before the 42 judges are worth dwelling on, because they are, in effect, a concise statement of ancient Egyptian ethics. I have not stolen. I have not killed unjustly. I have not lied. I have not committed fraud. I have not reduced the measure of grain. I have not moved a boundary marker. I have not polluted the water. I have not caused suffering to others. I have not been deaf to the truth. I have given bread to the hungry. I have given water to the thirsty. I have not cursed the gods. I have not been violent. These are not abstract, philosophical principles. They are practical, specific, and recognizably human. They describe a life lived in fairness and care, a life that contributed to the community rather than preying upon it. They are, in their way, as sophisticated a statement of moral aspiration as anything produced by any civilization, before or since. The Egyptians did not believe that moral perfection was required. The scales were not calibrated to reject everyone. They were calibrated to detect a life fundamentally oriented toward rightness, a life that had, on balance, contributed more light than darkness. The goal was not sainthood but decency, the daily, patient, imperfect effort to act justly, speak truth, and give what you could to those who needed it. Let the image of those scales settle gently into your consciousness. Heart, feather, the great stillness of judgment, and somewhere beyond the scales, the warm green fields of eternity, where the Nile flows forever. Chapter 9. Mummification and the sacred art of preserving life. The Egyptian belief in the afterlife was not merely spiritual. It had profound physical implications, because the soul needed to be able to return to the body, because the body was the home the soul recognized, the form it had worn through a lifetime. The preservation of the body after death was a matter of the deepest religious urgency. A soul that returned to find its body destroyed would be disoriented, diminished, deprived of its physical anchor. And so the Egyptians developed, over centuries of experimentation and ritual refinement, the practice of mummification. The word mummy comes to us through the medieval Arabic word mummia, which referred to bitumen, a dark, tar-like substance that the medieval world believed was used in the mummification process, though this was largely a misunderstanding based on the darkened appearance of ancient mummies. The Egyptian process itself was far more complex than bitumen application, and far more sacred. The art of mummification was the domain of the priests of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and the guardian of the dead, and of specialized craftsmen called embalmers, who worked in designated places outside the main residential areas, often near the desert edge. The process took approximately 70 days, a period that was itself symbolically significant, corresponding roughly to the period during which the star Sirius was invisible from the Egyptian sky, disappearing below the horizon and then reappearing in a kind of stellar resurrection. The body was brought to the embalming house and laid out on a low stone table. It was first washed with natron solution. Natron was a naturally occurring salt found in the Egyptian desert, a combination of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, and then anointed with cedar oil and other aromatic substances. Then the embalmers began their work. The brain was the first organ to be removed. Using a long bronze hook inserted through the nostril, the embalmers would break through the thin ethmoid bone and withdraw the brain in pieces, then pour cedar oil through the nasal passage to dissolve any remaining tissue. This sounds alarming, but the Egyptians did not regard the brain as important. They believed that thought and consciousness resided in the heart, not the brain. So its removal was a purely practical matter of reducing organic mass that would otherwise decay. The abdominal cavity was then opened with a flint knife. Flint, rather than metal, was traditionally used for this cut, a ritual conservatism that continued long after metal tools became common, and the internal organs removed. The lungs, the liver, the stomach, and the intestines were taken out and carefully cleaned and dried. Each organ was placed in its own canopic jar, sealed with a lid carved in the shape of one of the 4 sons of Horus. Hapi the baboon protected the lungs, Tuamutef the jackal protected the stomach, Kebersenuef the falcon protected the intestines, and Imseti the human protected the liver. These jars were placed in the tomb alongside the mummy, so that the deceased would have their complete physical self in the afterlife. The heart was not removed. It was left in the body, sometimes wrapped in a linen packet and replaced, sometimes simply left in situ, because it would be needed for the weighing at the moment of judgment. To remove the heart would be to deprive the deceased of their moral and spiritual core. The heart was the person in the Egyptian understanding. To preserve it was to preserve the self. The body cavity was then packed with natron, the desiccating salt, both inside and out, and the whole body was covered in natron and left to dry for 40 days. This was the critical period of preservation. The natron drew all the moisture from the tissues, arresting the process of decomposition, transforming the soft, perishable body into something firm and lasting. After 40 days, the natron was removed. The desiccated body was lighter than it had been. A mummy typically weighs far less than a living person, and somewhat shrunken and leathery. The embalmers would now stuff the body cavities with linen and sawdust and even sand, restoring its natural shape as much as possible. The skin was rubbed with oil to keep it supple. Sometimes the eyes were replaced with linen padding or stone. The mouth carefully closed, the expression peaceful. Then came the wrapping, the most ritually elaborate part of the entire process. Hundreds of yards of fine linen were used, applied in careful overlapping layers, with amulets placed between the wrappings at specific points on the body. Protective symbols and sacred objects whose magical power would shield the deceased from the dangers of the underworld. A gilded mask was sometimes placed over the face. Priests recited spells over the body at each stage of the wrapping, their voices joining the slow accumulation of linen and magic. The finished mummy was placed in its coffin, or, for the very wealthy, in a series of nested coffins, each one more splendid than the last, the innermost sometimes made of solid gold. The coffin was decorated with images of protective gods, with painted eyes at the head so the deceased could see out, with inscriptions of spells and prayers covering every surface. The face painted on the lid was idealized. Calm, beautiful, serene. The face of a person at peace, ready for the journey that lay ahead. The funeral procession carried the coffin across the Nile on a beautiful decorated boat. The West Bank was the land of the dead, and crossing the river was the first stage of the journey to the underworld. Mourners walked in procession, some of them professional, paid to weep and cry out. Priests burned incense. The scent of kaifi, a complex aromatic compound made from honey and raisins and myrrh and juniper and many other ingredients, rose into the Egyptian air. At the tomb, the opening of the mouth ceremony was performed. A priest wearing the mask of Anubis used a series of sacred instruments to symbolically restore the mummy's senses, to open its eyes, its ears, its nose, its mouth, so that it could eat and drink and speak and see in the afterlife. It was the last gift of the living to the dead. A door opened with love into eternity. Chapter 10. The Pyramids. Mountains built for eternity. The pyramids of Egypt are among the most extraordinary things human beings have ever made. They are old beyond easy comprehension. The oldest of the major pyramids at Giza is nearly 4,600 years old. They are large beyond easy visualization. The Great Pyramid contains enough stone to build a wall around France, and they are precise beyond easy explanation. The four sides of the Great Pyramid are aligned with the four cardinal directions, with an accuracy that modern engineers, using the most sophisticated instruments available, have been able to improve upon only marginally. But before the Great Pyramids, there were smaller, simpler things. The story of the pyramid begins not with Giza, but with a man named Imhotep and a king named Djoser, who ruled Egypt around 2650 BCE, in the period we call the Old Kingdom. Before Imhotep, the royal tombs of Egypt were mastabas, long, low, flat-topped structures of mud brick, large and solid, and permanent but unremarkable in form. Imhotep had an idea. He took the mastaba form and stacked another, smaller mastaba on top of it, then another on top of that, then another, and another, and another. 6 in total, each one smaller than the one below, rising in steps toward the sky. The result was the step pyramid of Djoser at the site of Saqqara near the ancient capital of Memphis, and it was, at the time of its construction, the tallest structure in the world. Imhotep's genius was recognized in his own lifetime, but it was amplified enormously after his death. He was venerated as one of the greatest sages Egypt had ever produced. He was eventually deified, raised to the status of a god, and worshipped across Egypt and beyond for his wisdom, his healing arts, and his architectural genius. The Greeks, who encountered his cult during their own period of cultural contact with Egypt, identified him with their god of medicine, Asclepius. A man who began life as a commoner, elevated by talent to the heights of royal service, became a god after his death. After Djoser, the pharaohs experimented with different pyramid forms. The bent pyramid of Sneferu at Dashur began at a steep angle that proved structurally problematic, and its builders reduced the angle partway up, producing the distinctive bent profile that gives the pyramid its name. It is, to modernize, oddly charming, the only pyramid in Egypt that clearly shows us the builders thinking in real time, adjusting, problem-solving, learning. Sneferu's builders took what they had learned from the bent pyramid and applied it to the red pyramid, also at Dashur, which was the first successful true smooth-sided pyramid. Its outer casing stones, if they had survived, would have made it a perfect geometric form. From the red pyramid, it was a short conceptual step to the Great Pyramid of Giza. Khufu, the pharaoh who ordered the Great Pyramid, is a somewhat mysterious figure. His name was known to ancient tradition, but relatively few artifacts bearing it have been found. Ironic, given that he built the largest monument in the ancient world. A small ivory figurine discovered in the 20th century is perhaps the only surviving portrait of Khufu, a tiny object, only a few centimeters tall, somehow surviving from the same man who built something that covers 13 acres of ground. The logistics of building the Great Pyramid are staggering to contemplate. Roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, were quarried, transported, and placed with extraordinary precision. The limestone-facing stones, which once covered the entire pyramid in gleaming white, were quarried at Tura, across the river, and transported by boat. The granite used for the interior chambers was quarried at Aswan, more than 500 miles to the south, and moved by boat down the Nile. The organization required to manage thousands of workers, hundreds of boats, and decades of continuous construction was, by any measure, one of the greatest administrative achievements in human history. Recent excavations near the Giza Plateau have revealed the traces of the city that housed the pyramid workers: bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, administrative offices. The evidence suggests a well-organized, well-fed workforce, not slaves driven by fear, but skilled laborers and craftsmen working for wages, or for something very much like wages in the Egyptian context: food, clothing, medical care, and the honor of building for the divine pharaoh. Inside the Great Pyramid, 3 chambers have been identified. The lowest, known as the subterranean chamber, was cut into the bedrock beneath the pyramid's base and was apparently abandoned unfinished. The middle chamber, called the Queen's Chamber by early Arab explorers, is located at the center of the pyramid's mass. The upper chamber, the King's Chamber, is the most impressive. A room of polished red Aswan granite, its walls and ceiling composed of enormous granite slabs, each weighing dozens of tons. Its acoustic properties almost supernatural. Sounds made inside the chamber echo and linger in a way that was presumably deliberate. The King's Chamber contains a single object, a large granite sarcophagus, lidless and empty. The mummy of Khufu was removed in antiquity, most likely by the priests who knew that the great tombs were being robbed and who moved royal mummies to safer locations. We know what the Great Pyramid looked like, and we know the extraordinary effort that went into building it. We do not know where the pharaoh who ordered it finally rests. The pyramids of Giza were among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and they are the only wonder to survive. All the others, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, are gone, destroyed by earthquake or fire or the patient erosion of time. The pyramids remain. They will almost certainly outlast every structure that exists today. There is something humbling about this. The pyramids were built by people who are dust. They were built for gods who are forgotten. They were built as homes for the eternal dead of pharaohs who are long departed. And yet they stand, as solid and as real as the day they were completed, as if the stone itself had decided to resist the passage of time on behalf of the people who shaped it. As if the mountain, once made, refused to be unmade. Let that thought settle into you as you drift towards sleep. Mountains of stone built against the forgetting of time. And in the very heart of the mountain, a room of polished granite, perfectly quiet, and the echo of a name spoken long ago, still hanging in the air. Chapter 11. The New Kingdom, Egypt at its height. The Old Kingdom, which gave us the pyramids, ended around 2160 BCE in a period of political fragmentation and social instability. The central authority of the pharaoh weakened. Local governors grew powerful. The carefully maintained administrative machinery of the Egyptian state began to break down. It was a dark period, remembered in later Egyptian literature with a kind of horrified nostalgia. The great order had failed, and chaos had crept in at the edges. Then came the Middle Kingdom, a period of reunification and cultural flourishing, a time of great literature and refined art, of expanded trade networks and architectural achievement. And then, in its turn, the Middle Kingdom also ended, this time in a more dramatic fashion. For the first time in Egyptian history, the land of the Nile was conquered by foreigners. The Hyksos, a people from the Levant, the region we now call Israel and Palestine and Lebanon, came into Egypt gradually, first as traders and settlers in the Delta region, and then, around 1650 BCE, as rulers. They brought with them technologies that Egypt did not yet have: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, bronze weapons. They established their own dynasty in the north of Egypt, taking the title of Pharaoh and ruling with a degree of cultural assimilation that went some way toward making them acceptable to the Egyptians, though they were never truly loved. The expulsion of the Hyksos, around 1550 BCE, was the founding act of what we call the New Kingdom, the period often described as Egypt's imperial age, the moment when Egypt became not just a great civilization, but a superpower in the full sense of that word. The Pharaoh Ahmose I, who drove the Hyksos out of Egypt and pursued them into Canaan, is credited with beginning this transformation. He reorganized the army, introduced the chariot as a standard element of Egyptian military technology, and launched a program of temple building and religious revival that set the tone for the 3.5 centuries that followed. The New Kingdom is in many ways the Egypt of popular imagination, the Egypt of Karnak and Luxor, of Abu Simbel and the Valley of the Kings, of Rameses and Nefertiti and Tutankhamun and Nefertari. It was a period of extraordinary artistic achievement. The temples built during this era are among the finest examples of monumental architecture in human history. It was a period of military expansion. Egyptian power extended north into Canaan and Syria, south into Nubia, east toward Mesopotamia. It was a period of rich cultural exchange. The pharaohs corresponded with the kings of Babylon and Mitanni and the Hittites in a diplomatic language they all shared. The Valley of the Kings, a hidden desert valley on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, its pale limestone cliffs pitted with the entrances to dozens of royal tombs, was the new kingdom's answer to the pyramids. The pharaohs of this era had learned, from the experience of the Old Kingdom, that a pyramid was, in essence, a giant arrow pointing at the treasure inside. Better to hide the royal burial in an underground tomb, cut deep into the living rock, concealed behind blank cliff faces in a remote and guardable valley. The tombs of the Valley of the Kings are among the most beautiful spaces ever created. Their walls are covered, from floor to ceiling, with painted reliefs of extraordinary richness and delicacy, images from the Book of the Dead, scenes from the mythology of the underworld, portraits of the pharaoh in the presence of the gods. The colors, protected for millennia by the dry desert air, are still vivid in many tombs. The deep blue of the sky, goddess Nut's body, the golden yellow of the divine flesh, the rich red and green and white of the hieroglyphic inscriptions. Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered by Howard Carter on the 4th of November, 1922, was small by the standards of the Valley of the Kings, a relatively modest burial for a relatively young and not particularly consequential ruler. And yet its contents constituted the most spectacular archaeological find in history. 4 rooms packed with objects of breathtaking beauty and historical richness. Painted chariots, golden thrones, alabaster vessels of extraordinary delicacy, clothing and sandals, musical instruments, games, flowers, placed in the tomb more than 3,000 years ago, still recognizable as flowers. And at the center of it all, nested inside 4 golden shrines, nested inside 3 coffins, the innermost of solid gold, the mummy of the young king himself, wearing his golden death mask with its serene and perfect face, his features idealized into divine beauty, his eyes made of obsidian and glass, looking upward into the darkness of the sealed tomb with an expression of absolute composure. He had been waiting, in the dark, for more than 3,000 years. Carter's description of opening the tomb's sealed door and peering inside by the light of a candle is one of the most famous passages in the literature of archaeology. When his patron, Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him in the narrow corridor, asked if he could see anything, Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." It is hard to imagine a more perfect summary of what ancient Egypt has given to all of us who come after it. Wonderful things, beyond counting, beyond measure, beyond the reach of time. Breathe gently now. Let your body be completely at rest. The Valley of the Kings is very quiet tonight. The desert stars are bright and cold, and in the darkness beneath the cliff, the golden mask reflects a light that has not been there for a very long time. Chapter 12. Sacred Animals, Sacred Spaces, the Living Presence of the Divine. One of the aspects of ancient Egyptian religion that most captivated the ancient Greeks and Romans, and that continues to fascinate the modern imagination, was the extraordinary reverence shown toward animals. Not merely symbolic reverence, not merely the use of animal images to represent divine qualities in art and sculpture, but a genuine, practical, deeply felt perception of certain animals as sacred, as vessels for the divine presence, living manifestations of the gods walking among the people. In the city of Memphis, the great religious center of Lower Egypt and the city of Ptah, the craftsman god, there lived at any given time a single sacred bull known as the Apis bull. This bull was not merely a symbol of Ptah. It was believed to be the living incarnation of the god himself, divinity made flesh, walking in the form of a magnificent animal among the people of Egypt. The Apis bull was identified by specific markings: a black coat, a white triangular blaze on the forehead, a crescent moon on its flank, and a particular pattern said to resemble a scarab beetle under its tongue. When an Apis bull died, priests from across Egypt searched all the herds for a calf bearing these exact markings, because the god had been born again and needed to be found and recognized. The living Apis bull resided in luxury in the temple of Ptah, attended by a staff of dedicated priests, fed on the finest grain, its movements watched and interpreted as divine oracles. Petitioners came from across Egypt to ask questions of the bull, depending on which stall it entered, which direction it faced, whether it ate from your hand or turned away. The priests would interpret its behavior as the answer of the god to your question. The bull was a living oracle, a breathing hot line to the divine. When the Apis bull died, of old age or illness, or the quiet mechanisms by which all living things eventually return to the earth, it was mourned with as much ceremony as a pharaoh. Its body was mummified with the same care and ritual attention as the most noble human being. It was then buried in the Serapeum, a vast underground complex at Saqqara, in long corridors cut from the living rock, in enormous granite sarcophagi, each weighing more than 70 tons. Dozens of Apis bulls were buried there over the centuries, each one interred with offerings and grave goods and the prayers of a nation. Cats held a place of special devotion throughout Egypt. The goddess Bastet, depicted as a woman with the head of a sleek and elegant cat, or simply as a cat sitting with her tail curled about her feet, was a goddess of home and hearth, of fertility and protection, of music and joy, and the warmth of the domestic circle. Her great temple at Bubastis, in the Delta, was one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in Egypt, and the annual festival held there was said by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus to draw hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, one of the largest annual gatherings in the ancient world. To harm a cat in Egypt was a serious offense. Even accidental killing could result in severe punishment. When a household cat died of natural causes, the entire family went into mourning, shaving their eyebrows as a sign of grief, just as they would for a human family member. The cat was then carefully mummified and taken to be buried at Bubastis, in the greater cat cemeteries that accumulated over the centuries into vast repositories of carefully wrapped feline remains. Archaeologists in the 19th century discovered these cemeteries and, with a casualness about antiquities that would horrify a modern scholar, shipped tons of cat mummies to Europe to be ground up for fertilizer. It is a sobering reminder of how recently the world learned to treat the past with respect. The ibis was sacred to Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom, and millions of ibis mummies have been found in the catacombs beneath temples dedicated to him. Offerings brought by pilgrims seeking the god's favor in matters of knowledge and learning, in the success of their children's education, in the accuracy of their written records. The ibis farms that supplied these offerings were, In essence, the ancient world's first large-scale animal breeding operations, maintained specifically for religious purposes. Crocodiles were sacred to Sobek, the crocodile god of the Nile's power and of royal might. In the Fayum oasis and at the site of Kom Ombo, crocodiles were kept in temple pools, adorned with golden earrings and jewelry, fed by the priests, regarded as the living presence of the god in the world. Sacred crocodiles that died were mummified and buried with great ceremony. The god they represented was both feared and propitiated. To honor Sobek was to acknowledge the wild and terrifying power of the river, and to ask it, with appropriate respect, to direct its force away from you. The falcon was sacred to Horus, the hawk-eyed god of the sky. The cobra, rearing in its defensive posture, was the uraeus, the symbol of divine power and protection that adorned the crown of every pharaoh and the forehead of every major deity. The hippopotamus, in its male form, was associated with Set, that dangerous and necessary chaos. In its female form, as the goddess Taweret, it was a protector of pregnant women and newborns, its massive and threatening body turned to the service of nurturing the most vulnerable. What unifies all of these divine animals is the Egyptian perception that the natural world is not merely material. It is not simply a collection of biological organisms going about their business in a world of blind physical causation. It is saturated with meaning. Every creature in it carries some quality of the divine, some face of the sacred that the Creator intended to express in that particular form. The falcon's high-soaring vision is the vision of the sky god. The ibis's patient stillness is the stillness of divine wisdom. The cat's perfect grace is the grace of a goddess. The crocodile's sudden, irresistible power is the power of a god. To live in this world, as the Egyptians did, was to live in a world that was perpetually speaking, that was always, in every bird and beast and reptile and fish, communicating something about the nature of the divine. Every moment of attention paid to the natural world was, in its way, an act of prayer. Every creature encountered was a potential messenger from the gods. Let that thought rest in you as you grow sleepier. The world is always speaking. Sometimes it speaks in stories told by a calm voice in the dark, and sometimes it speaks in the slow, patient movements of a bird at the water's edge, and you have to be very still to hear it. Chapter 13. Daily Life in Ancient Egypt. The People Behind the Monuments. We have spent much of our time together in the elevated world of gods and pharaohs, of temples and tombs and cosmic myths. But ancient Egypt was also, and perhaps most essentially, the world of ordinary people, farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and merchants, women spinning thread, and men loading grain onto boats, children playing in the dust of village streets, old people sitting in the shade and telling the same stories their grandparents had told them. The backbone of Egyptian society was the agricultural peasant, the farmer who worked the black soil of the Nile's edge, who watched the sky for the signs of the inundation, who ploughed and sowed and harvested in the eternal rhythm that the river imposed. The Egyptian farmer's year was divided into 3 seasons: Akhet, the inundation, when the Nile flooded and the fields were covered in water; Peret, the growing season, when the waters retreated and the crops could be planted, and Shemu, the harvest season, when the grain was cut and threshed and stored. These 3 seasons shaped every aspect of life, and their reliable progression was itself a theological statement. The order of the Nile was the order of Ma'at, made manifest in the turning of the year. Egyptian farmers grew emmer wheat and barley, the staple grains from which bread and beer, the 2 foundations of the Egyptian diet, were made. They grew flax for linen, the cloth from which all Egyptian clothing was made. They grew vegetables in the rich soil of their gardens, onions and garlic and leeks, lettuce and beans and lentils, cucumbers and melons. They kept cattle and sheep and goats, geese and ducks and pigeons. They fished the Nile with nets and hooks and spears. Life was not easy. It involved constant labor under a fierce sun. But it was not without its pleasures. Beer was the national drink of ancient Egypt, consumed by everyone from the Pharaoh to the humblest farm laborer. It was made from fermented barley bread and was thick and nutritious, more like a liquid food than a beverage in the modern sense. Workers on the pyramids and temples were partly paid in beer rations. Sick people were prescribed beer mixed with medicinal herbs. Beer was left in tombs for the dead to enjoy in the afterlife. When the Egyptian god of the harvest was celebrated, the celebration involved a great deal of beer. The Egyptian home was built of mud brick, the same material that has been used in this part of the world from the earliest human settlements to the present day. Mud brick is an excellent building material in a dry climate. It is easy to make, cheap to produce, and provides good insulation against both heat and cold. Egyptian homes were typically whitewashed on the outside and painted on the inside, their walls decorated with simple patterns or scenes from daily life. Wealthy homes had multiple rooms arranged around a central courtyard, with a garden where trees and flowers and vegetables were grown. Poorer homes were smaller and simpler, but the basic pattern was the same. Furniture was simple by modern standards, but not absent. Beds were wooden frames strung with rope or leather, sometimes raised on legs to allow air to circulate beneath them, a practical response to the Egyptian heat. Chairs and stools were common among those who could afford them. Chests and baskets held clothing and personal possessions. Oil lamps made from pottery or stone provided light after dark. The smell of cooking, bread baking, onions frying, fish grilling over charcoal, must have been a constant presence in Egyptian neighborhoods. Egyptian women had a legal status that was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably advanced. They could own property, initiate legal proceedings, enter into contracts, inherit from their parents, and divorce their husbands. A woman who brought property into a marriage retained ownership of it. A woman who was divorced was entitled to take her property with her. These rights were not always enforced perfectly in practice, and Egyptian society was certainly patriarchal in many respects, but the legal framework was one in which women had genuine standing. Marriage in Egypt was primarily a practical and economic arrangement, the joining of two households, the pooling of resources, the creation of a framework for raising children. But love was not absent from it. Egyptian love poetry, and there is a great deal of Egyptian love poetry, some of it among the most beautiful ever written, testifies to the existence of deep emotional attachment between men and women. the beloved is compared to rare wood, to precious stones, to the sweetness of honey, to the warmth of sunlight on the skin. The longing for an absent lover is compared to the thirst of a traveler in the desert. These are not merely conventional phrases. They carry the ring of genuine feeling. Children were deeply beloved in ancient Egypt. Medical papyri include extensive sections on pediatric medicine, the care of sick children, the treatment of childhood diseases, the use of amulets and spells to protect infants from harm. Children are depicted in tomb paintings, playing games and racing animals, and splashing in the water of garden pools. They learned their parents' trades from an early age. The son of a craftsman became a craftsman. The daughter of a weaver learned to weave. Those of sufficient intelligence and from families of some means might be sent to the scribal schools attached to the great temples, where they would spend years learning to read and write the hundreds of hieroglyphic signs, emerging as literate administrators who would staff the enormous bureaucracy of the Egyptian state. The scribal class was among the most privileged in Egypt. A scribe did not labor in the fields or on the construction sites. A scribe worked with his mind, with his brush and his palette and his rolls of papyrus, recording the grain harvests and the tax accounts, copying the sacred texts, writing the letters that held the empire together across its vast distances. Egyptian literature is full of texts praising the scribal profession, pointing out, sometimes with considerable condescension, how much better it was to work with words than with one's hands. Be a scribe, the texts say, and your name will endure. Plant your fields and your harvest will come and go, forgotten. But write your name on papyrus and it may survive forever. They were right, those ancient scribes. 3,000 years later, we are still reading their words. We are still speaking their names. The grain they harvested is long since eaten and digested and returned to the earth. But the words they wrote are here, tonight, in the quiet dark, reaching across all those thousands of years to lay their gentle hands on your sleeping mind. Rest now. The river is flowing. The grain is growing. Somewhere along the Nile, in the warm evening air, a family is sitting down to their evening meal, and the smell of bread and onions and fish rises into the Egyptian dusk, and someone, a grandmother perhaps, or an uncle, the kind of person every family has who carries the old stories, begins to speak, and the children lean in, their eyes bright in the lamplight, ready to listen. That is what we are, all of us, across all the centuries and all the distances. People leaning in toward a fire, ready to listen to a story, and the story, it turns out, is very, very old. The Egyptian understanding of medicine was also remarkable for its time. Egyptian physicians were the most respected in the ancient world. Rulers from Babylon and Persia sent for Egyptian doctors when they were ill. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world, describes surgical procedures and physical examinations with a clinical precision that sounds almost modern. It distinguishes between conditions that can be treated, conditions that may be treated, and conditions for which nothing can be done. A triage framework that would not be out of place in a modern emergency room. Egyptian doctors understood the heart as a pump. They performed surgeries, set broken bones, and developed a pharmacopoeia of hundreds of medicinal plants whose properties modern research has largely confirmed. The great gift of the ordinary Egyptians to history is not found in any single monument or any particular text. It is found in the simple fact of their continuity. 3,000 years during which they got up every morning, fed their children, tended their fields, kept their festivals, said their prayers, buried their dead with care, and tried, in the imperfect and daily way of all human beings everywhere, to live in Ma'at, to speak truth, to deal fairly, to give what they could to those who needed it, to leave the world a little better than they had found it. It is not a dramatic legacy, but it may be the most important one. Chapter 14. The Enduring Legacy, Egypt and the World It Made. Ancient Egyptian civilization lasted, in one form or another, for more than 3,000 years. That is a span of time almost impossible to comprehend. 3,000 years ago, ancient Egypt was already ancient. The pyramids of Giza had already been standing for 1,000 years when the Trojan War was fought. When Julius Caesar visited Egypt in 48 BCE, the Great Sphinx at Giza was already more than 2,000 years old. Older, relative to Caesar, than Caesar is to us. Civilizations do not simply end. They transform, they evolve, they are absorbed and adapted by what comes after them. And the civilization of ancient Egypt, despite the formal end of the pharaonic tradition with the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE, did not simply disappear from the world. It flowed outward, like the waters of the Nile at flood, enriching everything it touched. The Greeks were deeply, endlessly fascinated by Egypt. Greek philosophers traveled to Egypt to study with Egyptian priests. Pythagoras, according to ancient tradition, spent 22 years in Egypt. Plato studied there. Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, is said to have learned from Egyptian priests the account of Atlantis that he later brought back to Greece. Whether these stories are entirely accurate is a matter for scholars to debate, but they reflect a truth about the relationship between the two cultures. For the Greeks, Egypt was the source of ancient wisdom, the font of a knowledge older and deeper than their own. Egyptian religion traveled with Egyptian trade, and eventually with the armies and administrators of the Roman Empire into every corner of the Mediterranean world and beyond. The cult of Isis became one of the most widely practiced mystery religions of the ancient world, with temples and devotees from Britain to India. Her iconography, a divine mother seated on a throne, nursing her divine child, can be found from Spain to Mesopotamia. The very alphabet you are reading these words in traces its ancestry, in part, to Egypt. The Semitic alphabets of the ancient Levant, the direct ancestors of Hebrew and Arabic, and through them of the Greek and Latin alphabets, borrowed some of their fundamental structural principles from the Egyptian hieroglyphic system, which used consonantal signs in ways that anticipated the development of the true alphabet. When you read these words, you are using a tool whose deep history winds back through the centuries to the scribes of ancient Egypt, bent over their papyrus scrolls by the light of oil lamps, recording the names of gods. The great monotheistic religions that have shaped so much of world history, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all developed in the cultural world in which Egypt was the dominant civilization. The stories of the Hebrew Bible, many of which are set in or around Egypt, were composed by people who lived in the shadow of Egyptian power and culture. The theology of the Psalms, with its imagery of divine protection and cosmic order, resonates in interesting ways with Egyptian hymns to Ra and Amun. The concept of the soul, the hope of resurrection, the idea that the universe is governed by a just and all-knowing deity who cares about human behavior, all of these ideas have deep Egyptian precedents. In the 19th century, the decipherment of hieroglyphics by Jean-François Champollion opened the ancient world like a great sealed room, and the light poured in. Egyptology became one of the most exciting fields of scholarship in the world. Tourists flooded into Egypt to see the monuments they had read about. Museums in Europe and America filled with Egyptian antiquities. The ancient world spoke again in its own voice after a silence of more than 1,000 years. And what it said, when it spoke, was both strange and surprisingly familiar. The Egyptians worried about the same things we worry about: love and death and the passage of time, the behavior of children, the reliability of harvests, the fairness of rulers, the question of what comes after. They told jokes and wrote love poems and complained about their neighbors and hoped for better days. They grieved for their dead with a fullness of feeling that was the equal of any grief felt anywhere at any time. A papyrus love poem from the New Kingdom begins, "My heart is not yet done with your desires. Your voice to my ears is like the voice of a bird calling from the reeds, 3,000 years old, and still entirely recognizable, still entirely true. The pyramids still stand against the desert sky, as they have stood for nearly 5,000 years. The Nile still flows, wide and slow and generous, through the heart of Egypt, still carrying its dark, fertile silt to the fields along its banks. The great temple at Karnak still rises from the desert floor, its columns reaching upward, in a gesture that has always meant the same thing. There is something higher, something greater, something worth reaching for. Egypt is not the past. Egypt is in us, in the very structure of the alphabets we use, and the stories we tell, and the hopes we carry about what lies beyond the end of life. In the moral instinct that tells us to feed the hungry and give water to the thirsty. In the impulse to build something that will outlast us, to carve our names in stone against the forgetting of time. In the deep, wordless faith that the sun will rise again tomorrow morning, as it has always risen, as it will always rise. Osiris was murdered and dismembered, and gathered together by love and rose again. The Nile withdraws and returns. The grain dies in the ground and rises green in the spring. The sun sets in the west and makes its dark and dangerous journey through the underworld and rises again in the east, young and golden and full of warmth. Everything ends, everything returns. This is what the Egyptians knew, and what they built their whole civilization to express, that the universe is not hostile to life, that the darkness is not permanent, that the forces of chaos cannot ultimately prevail against the forces of order and love, that Ma'at is real, that the scales can balance, that the heart, weighed at the end of everything, can be lighter than a feather. This has been Nap Time Knowledge. Thank you for spending this long, quiet evening in the world of ancient Egypt. Let sleep come now, full and deep and restoring. Let your mind rest in the warm dark, surrounded by the presence of something very old and very patient and endlessly alive. The river is flowing, The stars are turning. The gods are at their stations, each one at their appointed post, sustaining the order of things. The sun will rise in the morning. It always does. Good night,